On a frozen February morning in 1999, in a small Alaska town where everyone knew their neighbors and doors were rarely locked, a young woman named Sophie Bergstrom walked out of her modest apartment to start her shift at the local diner and never came home. Her keys were found dangling in the lock of her front door. Her coffee mug sat steaming on the kitchen counter. Her coat hung on its usual hook. Sophie was 23 years old, a nursing student with dreams of working in pediatric care, beloved by everyone who crossed her path. The snow that morning was fresh and untouched, showing no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away except her own trail to the parking lot where her car remained, engine cold. In a place where winter darkness swallows the land for months and secrets freeze beneath the surface, Sophie Bergstrom became a ghost before lunchtime. The question that would haunt her family and investigators for more than 2 decades was simple and terrible. How does someone vanish in broad daylight from a building where neighbors watch through frosted windows? And why did it take 25 years to find out what everyone somehow already knew? Fairview, Alaska sat 40 miles outside of Anchorage, connected to the larger city by a 2-lane highway that twisted through valleys of spruce and birch. In 1999, roughly 800 people called Fairview home. It was the kind of place where the gas station clerk knew your grandmother's maiden name, where the post office doubled as the town's gossip center, where Friday night basketball games at the high school drew crowds that filled the bleachers to capacity. The economy ran on logging, seasonal tourism, and stubbornness. The winters were punishing. January and February brought temperatures that could drop to 30 below zero. Daylight became a precious commodity, the sun rising late and setting early, leaving residents to navigate their lives in a perpetual twilight that played tricks on the mind and made time feel elastic. Sophie Bergstrom had lived in Fairview her entire life. She was born there in the spring of 1976, the youngest of 3 daughters to Harold and Martha Bergstrom. Harold worked maintenance at the elementary school. Martha cleaned houses for the wealthier families who owned cabins along Eagle Lake. Sophie was the quiet one, the thoughtful one, the daughter who volunteered at the library every Saturday and who could be found reading medical textbooks at the corner cup coffee shop most afternoons. She had graduated from Fairview High School in 1994, spent a year working at her uncle's hardware store to save money, then enrolled in the nursing program at the community college in Anchorage. She made the drive 3 times a week. She was scheduled to finish her certification that spring. Those who knew Sophie said she had a particular way of listening that made people feel heard. She would tilt her head slightly, maintain eye contact, ask follow-up questions that showed she was genuinely interested. Children adored her. The elderly folks in town requested her specifically when she did her clinical rotations at the care facility on Maple Street. She had recently started dating a man named Derek Hollies, a carpenter who had moved to Fairview 2 years earlier from Washington State. They had met at a community bonfire in July. By autumn they were inseparable. By winter they were making plans. February 19, 1999 was a Friday. Sophie had the early shift at Maggie's Diner, the only restaurant in town that opened before 7 in the morning. She was expected at 6:30. Her alarm clock went off at 5:15. Her apartment was a small 1-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor of a converted house on Birch Avenue. The landlord, an older woman named Cecilia Grant, lived on the 1st floor. Cecilia would later tell investigators that she heard Sophie's alarm, heard the shower running, heard the familiar sounds of morning routine through the thin ceiling. Everything sounded normal. Everything sounded like every other Friday morning. Sophie showered, dressed in jeans and her diner uniform shirt, braided her long blonde hair the way she always did. She poured coffee into her favorite ceramic mug, the blue one with white stars that her middle sister had given her for Christmas. She buttered a piece of toast but left it sitting on a plate. She pulled on her boots, a heavy pair of insulated winter boots that came up to mid-calf. She grabbed her purse, a brown leather bag she had owned since high school. She walked to the door. Cecilia Grant was awake downstairs, making her own breakfast, listening to the morning news on her kitchen radio. She heard Sophie's door open upstairs. She heard Sophie's boots on the wooden stairs. She heard the outside door at the bottom of the stairwell open and close. It was approximately 6:20 in the morning. The temperature outside was 12 degrees. The sky was still dark. Fresh snow from the night before covered everything in a clean white blanket approximately 4 inches deep. Sophie's car, a 1994 Honda Accord, was parked in the small lot behind the building. There were 3 parking spaces total. Sophie's car sat in the middle spot. The car was locked. The windshield was covered in frost. Later, investigators would note that the engine was cold to the touch, that there were no signs anyone had attempted to start it, that the snow on the hood was undisturbed. Sophie's footprints led from the building's back door, across the parking lot, stopping at the driver's side door of her vehicle. The prints showed she had stood there. Then the prints led back toward the building, but they diverged from the path she had taken coming out. They moved along the side of the building, toward the alley that separated the property from the neighboring apartments, and then the prints simply stopped. Clear's throat at 6:45, Maggie Townsend, the owner of Maggie's Diner, called Sophie's apartment. There was no answer. Maggie tried 3 more times over the next 20 minutes. At 7:15, with the breakfast rush beginning and no sign of Sophie, Maggie called Martha Bergstrom. Martha said she would drive over to Sophie's apartment to check on her daughter. Martha arrived at 6:47. She knocked on the apartment door. No answer. She went downstairs and got the spare key from Cecilia. She let herself in. The apartment was quiet. The lights were on. Sophie's coffee mug sat on the counter, still warm. The piece of toast sat untouched. Sophie's coat hung on the hook by the door. Her apartment keys were hanging from the exterior lock, left dangling as though she had unlocked the door, intending to return in just a moment. Martha called out for her daughter. The bathroom was empty. The bedroom was empty. The living room showed no signs of disturbance. Everything was in its place, everything except Sophie. Martha ran downstairs and called the police from Cecilia's phone. A deputy arrived within 15 minutes. His name was Robert Quincy, a man in his 40s who had worked for the Fairview Police Department for 12 years. Deputy Quincy walked the apartment, noting details in his notebook. He went outside and examined the parking lot. He followed the footprints in the snow. He saw where they led to the car, where they returned toward the building, where they moved along the side wall, where they disappeared at the mouth of the alley. The alley itself was packed with older snow, compacted by vehicle traffic, showing no clear prints. Deputy Quincy noted the time, 8:07 in the morning. Sophie Bergstrom had been missing for less than 2 hours. By 9 o'clock, 6 officers were on site. By 10 o'clock, the police chief had called in assistance from the state troopers. By 11 o'clock, more than 30 volunteers had gathered at the town hall, organizing search parties. The word spread through Fairview like smoke through dry timber. Sophie Bergstrom was missing. Sophie, who everyone knew. Sophie, who was studying to be a nurse. Sophie, who smiled at strangers and volunteered with children. Sophie, who had no enemies and no reason to run. The search team spread out in grids. They walked the alleys, the side streets, the wooded areas at the edge of town. They knocked on doors. They checked garages and sheds. They examined ditches along the highway. The temperature remained below freezing. The daylight, what little there was, began to fade by 3 in the afternoon. Dogs were brought in. The dogs followed a scent from Sophie's apartment down the alley. then lost the trail near the intersection of Birch Avenue and Main Street. That intersection sat in front of Henderson's General Store, a place with steady foot traffic even on cold mornings. Vehicle tracks crisscrossed the area. The scent simply vanished. Derek Hollis, Sophie's boyfriend, arrived at the search headquarters around noon. Those who saw him said he looked stricken, pale, his hands shaking. He joined a search team immediately. He walked for hours, calling Sophie's name until his voice went hoarse. When investigators asked him routine questions about their relationship, about any recent arguments or concerns, he answered without hesitation. They had been happy. They were planning a trip to Seattle in March. There had been no fights, no tension, nothing unusual. He had last seen Sophie the night before, Thursday evening. They had watched a movie at his place, a rental from the video store. She had left around 9:30 to go home. He had walked her to her car. Everything had been normal. The first night passed with no sign of Sophie. The second day brought more volunteers, more search teams, media crews from Anchorage. Sophie's face appeared on the evening news. Her parents made tearful pleas for information. Flyers were posted on every telephone pole, in every shop window. The reward fund grew to $5,000 by Sunday. By Monday, it reached 10,000. Harold and Martha Bergstrom stood in their living room, surrounded by family and neighbors, and tried to comprehend how their daughter could simply disappear. The investigation intensified. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew Sophie, everyone who worked at the diner, everyone in the nursing program, everyone who lived near her apartment. Cecilia Grant repeated her statement multiple times. She had heard nothing unusual, just the normal morning sounds, then silence. The neighbors on either side of the converted house said the same. They had seen nothing, heard nothing. One neighbor mentioned seeing a dark pickup truck parked on the street that morning, but couldn't recall the exact time or any identifying details. Pickup trucks were common in Fairview. Nearly everyone drove one. Investigators examined phone records. Sophie's last call had been to Derek at 8:30 the previous evening, a brief conversation lasting 4 minutes. She had received a call from Maggie's diner at 6:45 that morning, but obviously hadn't answered. Her bank account showed no unusual activity. Her credit cards hadn't been used. Her car remained in the parking lot, impounded now as potential evidence. Forensic technicians examined it thoroughly. They found nothing. No signs of struggle, no blood, no foreign fingerprints beyond what would be expected. The alley where her footprints ended became a focal point. Investigators theorized she might have encountered someone there, might have been forced into a vehicle. But there were no witnesses, no one who had been looking out their window at that precise moment on that dark February morning. The alley connected to Main Street, which led to the highway. From there, Sophie could have been taken anywhere. For those who have ever lived in a small town, you understand how tragedy binds a community and how suspicion can poison it. People began watching each other differently. Conversations at the grocery store became guarded. Rumors started circulating. Some said Sophie had run away, overwhelmed by school and life plans. Others whispered darker theories, pointing fingers at various men in town, constructing elaborate scenarios with no evidence. Derek Hollis found himself under scrutiny simply because he was the boyfriend, because statistically, partners are always suspects. He endured multiple interviews, polygraph tests that he passed, searchers who examined his home and his work truck and found nothing incriminating. 3 weeks passed. The active search operation scaled back. Leads dried up. The case remained open, but the daily urgency faded. Life in Fairview slowly returned to its rhythm, though changed, shadowed. Sophie's face remained on posters, her name spoken in hushed tones. Her parents kept her apartment exactly as it was, unable to pack away her belongings, unable to accept that she might not walk back through the door. The question everyone asked, the question that had no answer, hung in the cold Alaska air. Where was Sophie Bergstrom? Part 2. The investigation. The state police assigned Detective Laura Finch to serve as lead investigator on the Sophie Bergstrom case. Finch was 38 years old, a 15-year veteran with experience in multiple missing persons investigations across Alaska. She arrived in Fairview on February 22nd and established a command post at the police station. She brought with her a methodical approach, a preference for documentation over intuition, and a belief that somewhere in the accumulated details lay the truth. Detective Finch began by reconstructing Sophie's final day. She interviewed Cecilia Grant 4 times, asking her to close her eyes and recall every sound, every detail. Cecilia described hearing the alarm, the shower, the footsteps, the doors. She had been making scrambled eggs. She had been listening to a news report about budget discussions in Juneau. She remembered the sound of Sophie's boots on the stairs, a familiar sound she heard every weekday morning. She remembered the outside door closing with its usual click. She had glanced at the clock above her stove. 6:22. Detective Finch walked the route from Sophie's apartment to the alley 17 times at various hours, in similar weather conditions. She timed how long it took to reach the car, to walk back, to move along the building's side wall. From door to the point where the footprints ended, approximately 90 seconds. The sun had not yet risen on February 19th. The streetlights in that area were functional but dim. The alley itself was shadowed, bordered by tall wooden fences and the backs of commercial buildings. Someone could have waited there. Someone could have approached Sophie as she walked along that wall, could have grabbed her, could have forced her into a vehicle parked in the alley, could have driven away before anyone noticed. But why would Sophie walk along the side of the building? Why not return the way she came? Detective Finch studied the footprint patterns. The prints showed no signs of running, no dragging, no disturbance beyond normal walking. They simply led along the wall and stopped. One theory suggested Sophie had dropped something, perhaps her car keys, and walked along the building looking for them. But her keys had been found in her apartment door. Another theory suggested she heard something or someone in the alley and went to investigate. But that seemed inconsistent with Sophie's cautious nature, with the darkness and cold of that morning. The dark pickup truck mentioned by a neighbor became a subject of intense focus. Detectives canvassed the town, documenting every dark-colored pickup. They identified 43 vehicles matching the general description. Owners were interviewed. Alibis were checked. Most could account for their whereabouts that morning. Several had been at home. A few had been driving to work. None raised immediate suspicion. Derek Hollis remained on the investigator's radar, not because evidence pointed to him, but because proximity always demands scrutiny. Detectives examined his background thoroughly. He had moved to Fairview in the spring of 1997 from Tacoma, Washington. He worked for a local construction company, specializing in custom carpentry. His employer spoke highly of him. Coworkers described him as quiet, reliable, skilled with his hands. He rented a small cabin 3 miles outside town. He had no criminal record. His finances were unremarkable. His phone records showed regular communication with Sophie, with his family in Washington, with work contacts. Nothing suspicious. Detective Finch visited Derek at his cabin on March 1st. She wanted to see his space, to observe him in his own environment. The cabin was tidy, modestly furnished. Derek invited her in without hesitation. He answered questions for 2 hours. He showed her the movie rental receipt from Thursday night, time-stamped at 6:15. He showed her photographs of Sophie, pictures they had taken together at various places around Fairview and Anchorage. He described their relationship in detail, how they met, What they talked about, their plans for the future. He wanted to marry her, he said. He was planning to propose in April. He had already bought a ring. "Show me the ring," Detective Finch said. Derek retrieved a small velvet box from his bedroom dresser. Inside was a simple gold band with a modest diamond. He had purchased it in January at a jewelry store in Anchorage. The receipt was in the box. Detective Finch noted these details. "Did Sophie know about this?" she asked. "No," Derek said. "I wanted it to be a surprise. Did you tell anyone?" "My mother, my brother, that's all." Detective Finch watched his face as they spoke. She had interviewed hundreds of people over her career. She had learned to read the small tells, the eye movements, the hand gestures, the shifts in posture. Derek Hollis appeared genuinely devastated. His grief seemed authentic. But she also knew that appearances could be carefully constructed, that some people were skilled actors, that the truth sometimes hid behind the most convincing performances. Clear's Throat investigators interviewed Sophie's classmates from the nursing program. They described her as dedicated, compassionate, occasionally stressed about exams, but generally optimistic. She had mentioned Derek frequently, always positively. She had shown them pictures. She talked about their plans to eventually move somewhere warmer, maybe Oregon or Northern California, once she finished her certification and gained some experience. No one reported any concerns about her safety, any fear of Derek or anyone else, any hint that something was wrong. The forensic examination of Sophie's apartment yielded minimal useful evidence. Fingerprints belonged to Sophie, her family members Derek, Cecilia Grant. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of struggle. The coffee mug tested positive for Sophie's saliva and fingerprints only. The toast on the plate showed no tampering. Her purse was missing, last seen in witness statements describing her leaving the apartment that morning. It was brown leather, medium-sized, containing her wallet, identification, approximately $60 in cash, a checkbook, various personal items. It had never been recovered. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the strangeness of the case. How does someone vanish so completely? In a town this small, someone should have seen something. A vehicle driving away at an unusual hour, a stranger lingering near the apartments, anything. But the morning of February 19th had been like countless other cold, dark February mornings in Fairview. People had been inside their homes, staying warm, preparing for their days, paying no attention to the street outside. One detail emerged that gave investigators pause. A man named Vincent Caro, who worked nights at the lumber mill just outside town, mentioned during his interview that he had driven through Fairview around 6:30 that morning on his way home. He traveled down Main Street, past the intersection where Sophie's footprints had terminated. He said he saw a vehicle parked near Henderson's General Store with its lights on, engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air. He couldn't identify the make or model with certainty. It had been dark and he was tired after his shift. He thought it might have been a truck or SUV, something larger than a standard car, but he couldn't be sure. He hadn't seen anyone near the vehicle. He had thought nothing of it at the time. Detective Finch added this to her timeline. If Vincent Caro's observation was accurate, that vehicle had been positioned precisely where Sophie's trail went cold. But identifying one vehicle among the many that traveled through Fairview each day proved impossible without additional details. The general store's owner arrived at his shop around 7:15 that morning and saw no vehicle parked nearby. Whoever had been there, if anyone, had already left. By mid-March, the investigation had generated hundreds of pages of reports, dozens of interviews, and no concrete leads. The case file included photographs of the scene, maps of search areas, witness statements, forensic analyses. Detective Finch created a timeline covering Sophie's last 72 hours, documenting every known movement, Every phone call, every interaction. Nothing pointed to an obvious suspect. Nothing explained how Sophie had disappeared. The possibility of voluntary disappearance was considered and dismissed. Sophie had no history of mental health issues, no financial problems, no secret life that anyone could uncover. She had been genuinely happy, genuinely looking forward to finishing her certification, genuinely in love with Derek. People don't leave behind hot coffee and buttered toast when they're planning to run away. They don't abandon their car, their identification, their life savings. They don't leave their keys hanging in the door. The theory that gained the most traction involved abduction by an unknown individual. Perhaps someone passing through town, someone with no connection to Sophie or Fairview, someone who saw an opportunity in that dark morning and took it. Predators existed. They moved through communities, leaving damage in their wake. Detective Finch contacted law enforcement agencies across Alaska, checking for similar cases, similar disappearances. She found several unsolved cases involving young women, but none with the same specific circumstances, none that seemed definitively connected. Summer arrived. The snow melted. Search teams combed areas that had been inaccessible during winter, hiking trails and riverbanks and dense forest. They found nothing. Autumn brought renewed media attention as the 6-month mark approached, then the 1-year anniversary. Sophie's face appeared on television again. Her parents made fresh pleas. The reward fund reached $25,000. Still nothing. Detective Finch remained assigned to the case, but her time became divided among multiple investigations. The daily urgency faded. The case didn't close, but it slowed. It joined the stack of unsolved mysteries that haunt police departments, files that get reviewed periodically but generate no new leads, names that officers remember but can't solve. For those who worked the investigation, the Sophie Bergstrom case became a haunting reminder of how completely someone can disappear. Not in the wilderness or the vast expanse of Alaska's remote territories, but in a small town on an ordinary morning. The case file grew dust. The evidence boxes sat in storage. The question remained unanswered. Derek Hollis continued living in Fairview for another year, then moved back to Washington. The weight of staying in the place where he had lost Sophie became unbearable. Before leaving, he visited Martha and Harold Bergstrom. They sat together in the living room where Sophie's photograph still hung on the wall, where her presence remained in every corner. Derek gave them the engagement ring he had bought. "She would have wanted you to have this," he said. Martha held the small box and wept. Part 3. The Silence. By 2003, 4 years after Sophie's disappearance, Fairview had absorbed the tragedy into its collective memory. Her face still appeared on posters in shop windows, faded now from sun exposure. Her name came up occasionally in conversation, usually accompanied by a sad shake of the head. The official investigation remained open, but active work had ceased. Detective Laura Finch had transferred to a different division. The case file sat in storage, periodically reviewed but generating no progress. Martha and Harold Bergstrom struggled through those years with the particular agony known only to families of the missing. At least with death there is finality, a grave to visit, a body to mourn. But Sophie existed somewhere in an undefined space between presence and absence. Her parents couldn't grieve completely because hope, terrible and persistent, remained. Every phone ring brought a flutter of possibility. Every knock on the door carried the chance that Sophie might be standing there, or that someone might finally have answers. Harold developed insomnia. He would wake at 3 in the morning and drive to the spot where Sophie's footprints had ended, sitting in his truck, engine idling, staring at the alley as though the passage of time might reveal something he had missed. Martha went to therapy, trying to process the impossible situation. The therapist gave her strategies for coping with ambiguous loss, techniques for accepting uncertainty. But acceptance felt like betrayal. To accept Sophie was gone meant giving up hope of her return. Their older daughters, Evelyn and Caroline, struggled as well. Evelyn had moved to Portland the year before Sophie disappeared, building a life separate from Fairview. She returned for searches, for anniversaries, but eventually the visits decreased. The pain of being in her childhood town, surrounded by memories of her youngest sister, became too much. Caroline stayed closer, living in Anchorage, visiting her parents monthly. She organized annual memorial walks, keeping Sophie's case in the public eye. But privately, Caroline wrestled with anger. Anger at whoever took her sister. Anger at police for not solving the case. Anger at God, at fate, at the universe's cruelty. The marriage of Martha and Harold began showing cracks by the 5th anniversary. Grief affected them differently. Harold withdrew, spending long hours at work, coming home exhausted and silent. Martha needed to talk, to remember, to keep Sophie alive through stories and shared memories. Harold found this unbearable. The conversations felt like picking at a wound that couldn't heal. They began occupying different spaces in their home, passing each other like polite roommates rather than partners who had spent 30 years together. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt suspicion creep into a relationship like water through a foundation crack, you understand how it destroys from within. In the absence of answers, the mind creates narratives. It takes small details and builds elaborate theories. Martha found herself wondering about things she had never questioned before. She remembered times Sophie had mentioned Derek, remembered reading between lines that probably contained nothing. Had Sophie seemed happy? Yes. But had there been something beneath the surface, something Martha had missed? These thoughts felt disloyal, even insane, but they persisted. Harold wondered too, though his suspicions pointed in different directions. He wondered about the stranger theory, about someone who had been passing through Fairview that morning. But he also wondered about people they knew, neighbors and acquaintances who had been interviewed and cleared. How thorough had those investigations been? Could someone have lied? Could someone have hidden something? The wondering became a disease that infected every interaction, making trust impossible. In 2007, 8 years after Sophie's disappearance, Martha and Harold separated. The decision came quietly, without drama, simply an acknowledgement that they could no longer help each other through the pain. Harold moved to a small apartment near the school where he still worked. Martha remained in the house, surrounded by Sophie's things. Neither pursued divorce. They remained connected by grief and habit, and the faint possibility that someday Sophie might return and need to find them. The 10th anniversary brought another surge of media attention. Local news channels ran retrospective pieces. A documentary crew from a true crime podcast spent a week in Fairview, interviewing anyone who would talk. The podcast episode, released in March 2009, reached a large audience. Tips flooded the police department. Most were well-meaning but useless. Some were from people claiming psychic visions. A few were cruel pranks. One tip seemed promising. A woman in Oregon claimed to have seen someone matching Sophie's description working at a grocery store in Eugene. Investigators followed up. The woman was not Sophie. Derek Hollies had rebuilt his life in Washington. He married in 2005, a woman named Jennifer he met through friends. They had a daughter in 2007. He rarely spoke about Sophie, not because he had forgotten, but because the memory remained too painful. His wife knew the story, knew about the relationship, knew that Derek carried that loss with him. Sometimes she would wake at night and find him sitting by the window, staring out at nothing. And she would know he was thinking about the morning 25 years ago when the woman he loved vanished. Clear's throat in Fairview, life continued with the slow inevitability that defines small-town existence. People aged. Businesses opened and closed. The elementary school where Harold worked underwent renovation. Maggie's diner changed ownership twice but kept the name. The Corner Cup coffee shop, where Sophie used to study, closed in 2012. The building was converted into a yoga studio. The markers of Sophie's life gradually disappeared, replaced by new establishments and new memories, but some people remembered. Cecilia Grant, Sophie's former landlord, remembered every detail of that February morning. She had long since rented Sophie's apartment to other tenants, had repainted the walls and replaced the carpet, but she still heard phantom footsteps sometimes on her ceiling. Still thought of the young woman with the kind smile who had vanished. She had nightmares occasionally, dreams where she looked out her window and saw Sophie walking down the alley, always moving away, always impossible to reach. Vincent Caro, the lumber mill worker who had seen the vehicle parked near Henderson's General Store, carried his own burden. He replayed that morning constantly in his memory, trying to extract more details, trying to see what he had missed. He wished he had paid more attention, had noted the license plate, had stopped to see who was in the vehicle, but hindsight offered no comfort, only regret. The case file sat in storage at the state police headquarters in Anchorage, one box among thousands, a life reduced to documentation and photographs. Occasionally, a new detective would pull the file, review it with fresh eyes, and add a note. No new leads, case remains open. The box would be returned to the shelf. Time would pass. The cycle would repeat. By 2015, 16 years had passed. Martha Bergstrom was 68 years old. Harold was 71. Their hair had gone gray. Their faces carried the weight of years spent waiting for answers that never came. Sophie would have been 39. She might have finished her nursing certification, might have married, might have had children. Martha sometimes imagined what Sophie's life might have looked like, creating an alternate timeline where that February morning had gone differently. But in the real timeline, Sophie existed only in memory and photographs, forever 23, forever smiling, forever gone. The town of Fairview had moved on, as towns do, but beneath the surface the question remained, silent and unanswerable. What happened to Sophie Bergstrom? Part 4. The revelation on November 12, 2024. A phone call came into the Alaska State Police headquarters that would finally break the silence. The call came from a woman who identified herself as Jennifer Hollies. Her voice was shaking. She told the dispatcher she had information about the Sophie Bergstrom case. She said her husband, Derek Hollies, had confessed something to her the night before during an argument. The dispatcher connected her to Detective Marcus Webb, who had recently been assigned to review cold cases. Jennifer Hollies explained that her marriage to Derek had been deteriorating for years. There had been arguments about money, about parenting, about trust. The previous evening, during a particularly heated fight, Derek had been drinking. He said things he had never said before. He told Jennifer that he couldn't keep living with the guilt. He told her what had happened on February 19, 1999. Detective Webb listened, taking notes, his hand moving faster as the story unfolded. When the call ended, he immediately contacted the FBI office in Seattle and the Fairview Police Department. Within hours, a team was assembled. Arrest warrants were prepared. The 25-year-old case was suddenly, urgently active again. On November 13, 2024, at approximately 6 a.m, Derek Hollies was arrested at his home in Tacoma, Washington. Federal agents and local police surrounded the house. Derek was handcuffed in his driveway, still wearing his pajamas, his daughter watching from an upstairs window. Neighbors stood on their porches, witnessing the scene. The man who had lived among them for years, the quiet carpenter who coached youth soccer and helped with community projects, was led to a police vehicle and driven away. The confession Jennifer had reported was this: Derek had killed Sophie on the morning of February 19, 1999. He had been waiting in the alley beside her apartment building. They had argued the night before, after she left his place. Sophie had told him she was having doubts about their relationship, about the future. She wanted to slow down, to focus on finishing school, to figure out what she really wanted. Derek had not taken this well. He had driven to her apartment early that morning, parked in the alley and waited. When Sophie came out to go to her car, she saw it was frosted over and realized she had left something inside the apartment. She walked back along the side of the building, taking the shorter route to the door. Derek stepped out from the shadows. He tried to talk to her, to convince her to change her mind. Sophie said no. She said she needed space. Derek grabbed her arm. Sophie tried to pull away. Derek put his hands around her throat. He told Jennifer that he hadn't meant to kill her, that he just wanted her to listen, that everything happened so fast. Sophie struggled for less than a minute. Then she went still. Derek panicked. He picked up her body, carried her to his truck, parked in the alley with the engine running. He placed her in the bed of the truck, covered her with a tarp he used for work. He drove north on the highway, away from Fairview, deeper into the wilderness. He knew the area well from his construction work. 30 miles up the road, there was a Forest Service trail that led to an old mining site, long abandoned. He drove as far as the truck could go, then carried Sophie's body into the woods. He buried her in a shallow grave, covering it with rocks and branches. He returned to his truck. He drove home. He cleaned everything. He disposed of the tarp. And then he waited. When Sophie was reported missing, Derek acted shocked. He joined search parties. He answered questions. He passed polygraph tests because he had convinced himself in some fractured part of his mind that he was innocent, that what had happened was an accident, that he was a victim too. He maintained this delusion for 25 years. He married another woman. He had a child. He built a new life. But the truth remained, buried in the forest along with Sophie's body, waiting to emerge. Clear's throat, Detective Webb, and a team of forensic specialists traveled to the location Derek had described. On November 16th, they began excavating the site. The area had changed in 25 years. Trees had grown. The landscape had shifted, but Derek's directions were precise enough. On November 18th, they found remains. The medical examiner confirmed the bones belonged to Sophie Bergstrom. She had finally been found. The news broke across Alaska and then nationally. Sophie Bergstrom, missing for 25 years, had been murdered by her boyfriend. The man everyone had felt sorry for, the man who had seemed so devastated, the man who had passed every investigation, had been the killer all along. The revelation stunned Fairview. People who had known Derek, who had comforted him during the searches, who had believed in his grief, felt betrayed and horrified. Those who had always suspected him felt vindicated, but took no pleasure in being right. Martha and Harold Bergstrom received the call from Detective Webb on November 18th. Martha collapsed when she heard the news. Harold sat beside her, holding her hand, tears streaming down his face. Sophie was dead. They had known somewhere deep inside, but confirmation brought a different kind of pain. At least now they could bury her. At least now they knew the truth. Derek Hollies was extradited to Alaska to face charges. He was arraigned on 1 count of first-degree murder, 1 count of evidence tampering, and 1 count of providing false information to law enforcement. He pleaded not guilty initially, but his lawyer advised him that the evidence was overwhelming. Jennifer's testimony would be damaging. The confession he made to her was admissible. The location of the body, known only to the killer, eliminated any possibility of coincidence. In January 2025, Derek changed his plea to guilty. Sentencing was scheduled for March.